Okay, I think everyone who is going to be here is here, so we can go ahead and get started. For purposes of roll, I assume you already know who's here and who's not. So
yes, sir.
You can move me on that. Paul sent out a copy of minutes from the last meeting. Assume you've had a chance to review that. Does anyone have any suggested changes to that? Or if not, is there a motion to adopt the minutes? It's been moved and seconded to adopt the minutes from the last meeting. Any objections? They're adopted. The order that I'd like to go in based on the availability of some of our guests today. So we'll start with competency-based education, then discuss the funding recommendations, then the additional charges that Dr. Moore brought to the last meeting, and then we will finish up with outcomes-based funding, where I think most of the discussion potentially may be. So on competency-based education, my understanding is that we have Dr. Van Davis on the phone with us. Is that right?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, Van.
And I'm going to interrupt and remind everybody that this is being webcast, so behave yourselves.
Was that directed at me?
No, in general.
At the last meeting, we had quite a bit of discussion on this particular charge, and I recommended that each of you visit with people at your institutions, and then if you had any particular proposals that you wanted before the committee on this, to send those to Paul. And my understanding is that, Paul, you did not receive anything. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So, again, the charge here is for us to make any recommendations back to the commissioner on, I guess, whatever guidelines or steps are necessary to implement some sort of funding mechanism for these type of courses if we feel that's appropriate. And in some of the discussion last time, I think we realized that there are a lot of different types of programs that qualify as competency-based that are operated differently, some of which lend itself to a funding formula of one sort or another, some which do not, at least not very easily. So I guess in terms of getting to some sort of closure on this, we'll definitely have a November meeting. I'm guessing, depending on how the outcomes-based funding discussion goes, we may have that December meeting as well. But there's not a lot of time between that November meeting and December meeting, so this meeting needs to be a meeting where we really get our issues on the table so that we can start developing some recommendations to the extent that we want to do that, and then have that language circulated to the members in time for that November meeting, if at all possible. And I know that's certainly Paul's preference because he's going to have to shepherd a lot of this. So based on what we discussed last time, does anyone want to start any discussion in terms of how you think the advisory committee ought to address this issue? My understanding is that he wasn't actually going to do a presentation.
This is actually kind of some bullet points and information, and then he's really on the line to answer any questions that might come up.
I think in looking...
And let me apologize ahead of time. This is what happens for the formatting issues. If Paul didn't fix them for me, this is what happens when somebody tries to put a PowerPoint together on an iPad.
I did notice in that advanced presentation, the page that has a slide for direct assessment. Based upon this definition of competency-based learning, it seems like it's pretty much anything that's tied to any kind of direct assessment.
Well, I think it's important to understand that not all competency-based education falls into the category of what the Department of Education defines as direct assessment, and that's the definition that I've provided for you, is the Department of Education's definition of direct assessment. And that's, I think, something that's very important to understand, that we talk a lot about competency-based education right now, and not all of it fulfills the definition of direct assessment. And in fact, Department of Education has actually denied applications to tie direct assessment to federal financial aid for Northern Arizona University, which is one of the major competency-based programs out there. Northern Arizona is still able to access Title IV financial aid, but they're not considered to be a direct assessment program by the Department of Education because they link their competencies back to courses, and they do it within the context of the traditional course structure.
And we did have some discussion of that last time. To the extent that you can tie back to the traditional structure, then it's certainly easier to handle from a funding perspective. Let me ask this. In terms of the pilot that's underway right now with Commerce, so if we did nothing at this point in time, as we go into the next cycle for funding, how would the coordinating board handle those particular courses or modules, I guess they're being called?
Okay, go ahead, Dan.
Well, right now, and it's so the program that Commerce and South Texas College are doing, because we have tied all of the competencies back to courses, we have a map. So although students will be enrolled in competency modules, or that's what they'll go through, are modules, each of those modules is tied back to a course. And so the way that we've structured it right now is that the institutions will be able to receive formula when the student completes all of the competencies associated with that course. And only at that point will it be transcripted, and then only at that point will they be able to report it for formula. And Susan, please correct me if I've misstated how y'all are going to handle that.
Nope, you got it.
Okay, so your semester credit hours in the cost matrix is based on the 20th class day enrollment.
For the competency-based programs, it will only be based on when they report it, which will be upon completion. So for them, it's not just the 20th class day, it's when they complete all the competencies for an individual course.
Why would it be different for competency-based?
Because in competency-based, what you're focusing on is mastery. You're not focusing on time. It becomes irrelevant to talk about time. We have a model where students can take as long as they need to or as short as they need to. So in some cases, it might be possible the student could complete all of the competencies associated with a course in less than 20 days. It might take them 2 or 3 terms, depending upon how they have decided to navigate through the competencies. And again, with competency-based education, mastery is what is constant. Time is the variable. And so once you have time as a variable, then 5th day in course, 20th day in course becomes irrelevant.
Equate that to an incomplete course taken for a student now. Semester credit hour is counted on the 20th class day, and they may not finish it.
And Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, on the competency program, they don't necessarily say, I'm going to take the competencies associated with this course, and this course. They start.
It's going to.
So you would be hard-pressed to say which courses they are attempting, maybe at the beginning of a semester or whatever you want to call it.
Well, I think we will be able to do that. I mean, again, one of the things that's important in this is that we're underlying this program with a pretty extensive advising model. Although we're allowing flexibility for students to dip in and out this first year, we may see that is not feasible, and we may require them to enroll in a quote-unquote course in the student information management system But what they're still going to be working through are the competency modules that are associated with that course. It may mean that we see students who have incompletes from term to term, and that's one of the things that we're trying to sort of figure out how we deal with. For those students that want to receive federal or state financial aid, they actually will still have to meet that institution's satisfactory academic progress policy, and that means that they will have to complete a certain number of competencies that equate back into the semester credit hours. In our case, over 2 terms, because our terms are 7 weeks in length. They're not a traditional semester length term. It's I recognize that it is a different way of thinking about courses and student mastery and student knowledge. And many of our old ideas, such as incompletes, don't work the same way now when we start talking about mastery as the important key here. And our systems have not made that transition yet. So what we're doing, and I think this is what a number of competency-based programs across the nation are doing. Some of you may have seen the Chronicle of Higher Ed article and the NPR piece about the University of Wisconsin System's flexible degree that came out earlier this week, is many of these programs are still trying to fit these old models of semester credit hour, incomplete, and try to sort of fit mastery-based knowledge and education into those structural issues. But it does create a great deal of challenges.
I guess I'm not arguing whether you count the semester credit hour here or there. I'm just trying to understand why you would. I don't really see the distinction between a competency-based course and a regular course that's offered. Why wouldn't you count that semester credit hour when you start it, just like you would anything else?
For us, it's because the student hasn't completed it yet, and we don't know how long it's going to take the student to complete it. We're using a model where a student may, so for example, we tend to have somewhere between 5 to 7 competencies that are attached to each course. We may have a student who starts, say, their mathematics, and they do 3 of them, and then they decide, I hate math, I cannot stand doing any more math right now, I will fail if I have to keep doing this, I need to take a break and do something else. And so we're giving them the flexibility to do that. The point at which they come back and return to the math will be left up to the student in consultation with their advisor. But it could foreseeably, you could have a student that for a subject that they have extreme difficulty in, it might take them much longer than 1 or 2 terms to do it because they may need to dip in and out of it. Whereas I think when we look at a traditional or even an accelerated course, it's a fixed period of time. That student knows they have X number of weeks to be able to complete this because that semester is fixed and they're expected to complete the course in that semester. In this case, they're not necessarily expected to complete it unless they're going to be on federal financial or state financial aid. And then we've got to make this fit in with the existing structures that govern student eligibility for financial aid.
That's the part that I was wondering how it was going to work, because you had referenced Pell funding at a certain point. So at the beginning of a term, it's got to be recognized as one of the loads, right? And in
Correct.
order to qualify for a certain amount of financial aid.
Correct. There is the possibility. The Department of Education earlier this year in the spring released a Dear Colleague letter where they made statute changes. So there is the possibility for the Department of Education to recognize a direct assessment program. This would be a program that's not tied back to courses for financial aid, for federal Title IV financial aid. That possibility exists. That possibility did not exist prior to this spring. However, right now there are only one or two institutions across the nation that have been able to successfully go through that process and be awarded that status. So that process is still in its infancy, and it's still working the kinks out. Southern New Hampshire University's College for America may be the one that many of you have heard about. They were the very first institution that received permission for the Department of Ed to link their financial aid to direct assessment, not to courses or anything else. Most institutions are not going that route because the DOE guidelines are really not clear yet, and because the DOE also very explicitly exempts an institution for eligibility if there are any traditional courses involved in the program. In our case, it's the lower division 90 semester credit hours that is competency-based, while the upper division is traditional accelerated coursework. So that would make our program ineligible from the start under the DOE regulations.
I think whatever we do now, I mean, we're obviously kind of working around the edges of this because there's not a lot of this going on out there. Everybody's trying to figure it out. But I think, as Van has alluded to, as this grows as a methodology for delivering education, its impact on the funding part of this becomes greater, and we have to make sure we, get comfortable with whatever that's going to be. I think in terms of, BJ, your question of the difference between this and the traditional course, my concern is that the traditional courses have a cost base to them, and this does not, at least not at this point in time. So I think at a minimum what the advisory committee would want to recommend is that the coordinating board do a cost study of these type of programs, realizing that there'll be, commerce may not be the only one they look at. They may look at various ones that are currently underway, and try to come back with some recommendations or guidelines on at least the type of data that needs to be collected for us to determine a cost that underlies these programs. Now, if we fall within a particular cost range on these generally, then I think that sort of lends itself to solving the problem. If it's varied quite a bit, then it gets more complicated, and I assume you could do a cost study and have something ready for the legislature to look at by next session, perhaps?
It probably will depend on how many institutions really start going down this path. If you only have one or two, you could look at cost. Not sure it'd be a valid way of looking at it. So it kind of depends on how many institutions start wanting to go down here. Otherwise, you're going to get some very skewed data, I think.
Yeah,
But I'm assuming that for funding right now, that the way that it would work is linking it back to the traditional course, so that you would get the formula funding that you would get for that traditional course. I mean, so that
I think that's right. I mean, as long as
it's tying back to a course, if we get to the point where we're doing direct assessment, we'll be calling y'all saying, okay, now what? But for right now, with everything being tied back to a course, we will put it through the regular formula.
So based on that, with this, I mean, it would be like where we've got flexible scheduling. So if we have something that starts after the 12th or 20th day class roll, you roll it into the next time when they complete. So that would be, if you've got this, it's whenever they complete all the competencies for that course, then it rolls into the next reporting period.
Correct.
All right. Have we looked at that from MOOCs as well, or how are we going to deal with?
I'll take suggestions. We have talked about them. MOOCs can be, and Van's going to correct me if I'm wrong, MOOCs can be used as maybe one of the competencies, or if you put a whole bunch of MOOCs together, it may be the whole course, but there's got to be something that ties it to a course at this point before funding is done.
Correct. I think that MOOCs become yet another modality They become another way for students to acquire knowledge. Part of what we're looking at now is a world in which the focus is on letting the learner find the ways that are best for them to acquire the knowledge. And so the focus is more on the learner and not so much on the institution. The interesting thing about MOOCs is we do have national experiments where institutions have created MOOCs and they're using them actually on their own campus. In many cases, part of what they've done there is in some cases, they still require some student contact on campus. It becomes a way of doing flipped hybrid education. We don't yet in Texas have institutions that are accepting MOOCs from other institutions. And most MOOCs have not sort of worked out the assessment piece. They've worked out the information delivery piece, but they've not worked out the transcription. And so you see people that are taking them for professional purposes. You see folks that are maybe interested in the content. They may be, as individuals, deciding to use those as supplemental instruction. We have a few institutions that are beginning to look at how it can be formally used as supplemental instruction. But the key issue is still what has to happen in order for the transcription to occur and for students to be able to then have that credit that transfers into the institution or that the institution recognizes. And that's a very different issue than necessarily the costs of producing it, unless the institution is producing a MOOC that they want to use.
Well, and part of the reason I asked that is I know we just had a huge discussion on campus on this because we've got 3, I think, under development right now. And so part of the difficulty becomes, and that's where they're trying to determine the assessment piece. So it would be if it's for credit or not for credit. Most of them are not offered for credit across the U.S. right now. Very few are offered for credit. We're trying to determine if we can assess these where we can offer them for credit. But the completion rates are usually only about 5%. So we'd have to look at that factor as well when we start thinking about whether there's an aspect of that for the formula funding or not. But it would probably have to be more on completion than what we've done with some of our other types.
With a 5% completion rate, I'm going to say we probably wouldn't want to fund on enrollments.
Well, but I want to hasten to add here, though, when folks talk about completion rate in MOOCs, one of the things that they oftentimes do not talk about is that you have something that is truly open enrollment. And you have a lot of people that are doing it because they're just interested in the topic. They're not seeking a degree. Maybe they're trying it out. It becomes a way for them to sample different topics. And they may decide after 1 or 2 weeks that they're not really interested in it. And so they don't complete it. It's a completion rate for MOOCs it's trying to use our traditional standard for something that has a completely different student population in it. Now, there are a small handful of MOOCs that ACE, the American Council on Education, has evaluated as a part of their ACE-MET transcription services. So there's a little bit beginning to be done in terms of how might these things be transcripted and turned into credit. But that is the danger when you talk about completion rate with MOOCs, is that you have a vastly different student population that's able to enroll in them. And because they're open and free, there's no cost for enrolling in them. So you certainly get a lot of folks that enroll in them because it seemed like a good idea at the time, and then they either don't like it or they're not interested in it or they don't have time to do it. And they never really engage or attempt to complete.
May I ask a question about some of the materials that you sent, Paul, about the competency-based courses? You said that Commerce has a contract with Pearson?
Correct.
That's correct.
And they pay Pearson for each student that that enrolls for a 7-week course. What do they pay Pearson?
That's
What's the amount?
not disclosed. We don't.
They do. The way that it operates is South Texas College and Commerce are a part of this, and for the lower division, they pay a per student per term fee to Pearson for curriculum, and that's the way that that will operate. At the upper division side, then it's a more traditional students are responsible for their own texts. But at the lower division side, we tried to fold that in. In terms of the cost, I have to go back and look at the contract in terms of what the disclosure issues are. So I'm a little hesitant to say that right now without looking at the contract to make sure that I don't break any disclosure agreements. It is a reasonable. I will say this. It is a reasonable cost that, from the student's perspective, is much less than what their textbooks would probably normally run them.
I was just trying to compare what the students are paying for the courses or for the term with what the institution was having to pay per student.
And we're still, this is the challenge that we are facing, and it's quite frankly the challenge that all of the other folks experimenting with this across the nation are facing, is trying to figure out how to calculate cost. We're a part of the EDUCAUSE Next Generation Learning Challenge grant program, which is primarily funded by the Gates Foundation. And Gates is actually working with and is having evaluators work with all of the grantees right now to try to develop a cost model for these programs that does a better job of getting at what the costs are for the institution, what the costs are for the student, and trying to look at where the points of affordability are, as well as where the break-even points are. We're still very early in those conversations. We're working, the evaluators are from Georgia Tech, RPK, and I believe WestEd. And so the grantees have seen a draft of that modeling, and they've had lengthy conversations with us, and they are going back and revising that. I suspect we'll see a second version of it when we meet in a couple of weeks in Anaheim at the EDUCAUSE meeting.
Thank you.
You know, I think my sense of all this is that this is an issue whose time is not ripe for us. The sky's the limit on where this could go, and if the people at MIT and Stanford still haven't figured it out, I don't know why we think we could. So,
I'm not going there.
It's because we're from Texas.
You know, obviously it's something we have to stay on top of. I think for any programs out there starting up that can tie to a traditional course, then I think the way that you suggest that would be handled now is the way it should be handled, is that as that course is completed, it gets credit. I do think we need to start investigating the cost of doing these type of programs. Obviously, Commerce is providing an example of what we can look at. There'll be, I assume, many other examples that we can look at as well, and try to get to the bottom of the cost. You know, there's a lot of the Pearson example is a good example of the complications, and I know in discussions we've had with Pearson about certain programs, they were going to cover some of the upfront cost. So the sort of traditional approach and the way you were going to treat Commerce would have worked perfectly fine because a lot of those upfront costs were going to be covered anyway and borne by them. And they were willing to wait until courses were completed. And obviously it was an incentive for them to make sure students completed the course for them to get reimbursed. So, again, I don't even know how to anticipate the different possibilities here for funding purposes. Mark was just suggesting that it's probably going to ultimately take a completely different funding model. Our model is pretty traditional. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're already talking about doing outcomes-based funding. There's some variation of that. This may actually fit better in an outcomes-based model where you're going to be rewarded based on the outcomes of these courses or something. I don't know, but I guess I would suggest that I think it's good. It'd be good for the coordinating board to develop a good review of this area. that explains all the work that's being done out there now, the different directions this could go, and with attention, obviously, to the funding issues involved with that.
And one of the things that Van just said that I didn't know, it's nice to come to meetings and we all get to know things, is that Gates is working on a cost model. And so getting input from that model that would be touching all those different competency programs and looking at that model as input into the whole thing would probably be very useful too once that's developed. And it may not be developed in time for this group, but for the next cycle, that sort of thing. And we can look at that. If there's, definite information that we need to start collecting, then we could start in the interim. But that would probably be a good model to start with, since it's going to be cutting across states and everything else.
And I know, for example, I'm at a meeting in Adult College Completion Network meeting right now, and I had a conversation earlier today with folks from the University of Wisconsin who are doing something somewhat similar, and they also are struggling with trying to figure out what their cost model is in terms of trying to better capture costs for something that doesn't look the way it normally does. I want to make sure, though, that I say that there are a lot of upfront costs to this, more so than I think you see with the development of traditional programs. And a big piece of that is because the institutional infrastructures are not established for this type of program. For example, one of the things that we're having to do right now is we're working with Learning Solutions by Blackboard, which does their consulting services, to help us develop an automated system whereby the competencies will be converted into courses. But that's not an easy technological egg to crack because of the way that learning management systems are set up and the way that student information management systems are set up. So in addition to developing curriculum, in addition to developing assessments and the ongoing costs, instructional costs associated with that, because we still have an instructional team that works with students throughout this program, there's also some unusual upfront costs in terms of figuring out how to make the existing infrastructures work for a program that they were never designed to work for. And that is what we're finding, at least, is that that's one of the most difficult challenges, and I've heard that from other programs around the nation. So these are not necessarily cheap programs to develop. It would be very difficult, I think, for our institutions to be developing this without the EDUCAUSE and the GAIFAC funds.
KG.
Mine's just kind of maybe a point of clarification. So our charge is to make recommendations on the treatment of competency-based. And I think what I'm hearing is that without a recommendation from this committee, competency-based would go through the cost matrix. Costs would be reported in the year incurred. The only difference would be semester credit hours would be held until completed.
Right.
So that's what would happen if this committee doesn't. And I think what I just heard you say is the recommendation is to utilize the existing, but to ask for some sort of cost analysis.
Right. That's right.
Do you need that in the form of a motion?
Ultimately, yes. It doesn't have to be today, but again, I think also both for the education of the form advisory committees in the future, and it's probably the next one that's going to have probably the bigger problem to deal with, but also for the legislature, is to develop this background piece on this issue that just tries to explain what's going on out there, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about it.
As it unfolds, we will try.
Okay. What I would suggest, rather than take a motion at this time, is that we'll develop a recommendation along the lines that BJ just described, and then if there is anything additional to that you think needs to be addressed as part of recommendations, that you send that to Paul before the next meeting, and then we can circulate whatever we need to prior to that next meeting, hopefully, so that when we come in November, we can actually vote at that time on what the actual recommendation will be.
Good.
Yeah.
Could I ask just one question? In the whole discussion, has prior learning assessment been a piece of that, in that discussion at all, or is that opening up a can of worms to?
We did discuss that last time, and actually David was here last time, and he brought that issue
Brought
up
it to prior
specifically
learning.
regarding those instruments.
Okay. All right.
I think that's kind of it's
almost
certainly a
just
part of this bigger pie.
An additional side issue.
Well, I mention it because it's something we're looking at seriously at Houston. Plus, we're developing MOOCs. Plus, we're looking at competency-based. And so, again, I think it folds into that larger point made that this is really different than what we normally do. And so, where we go on our recommendations, I think, really requires us to take a look at more than just competency-based, or we'll have to come back and revisit it again.
John, just a passing comment related to assessment of prior learning. Many of us are already doing that, especially those of us who are very near large military installations. And most of what we do is governed by the ACE guidelines. But prior learning assessment is already occurring. I think it adds yet another complexity to the complex piece we've already talked about here today. And the fact that, as John has already said, I think ultimately we're going to have a separate model for how do you fund this sort of learning approach. Another thing, and I know we're here for the issues of funding, and I know how hard Commerce and South Texas have worked on this model program. But one of the ultimate challenges out there also is the quality of what these programs are producing. Some of us are surrounded by, I in particular, virtually every proprietary institution that you ever heard of and some that you didn't. Many of them are using, quote, competency-based education and alleging that students can move through it very rapidly. And I think the whole issue of quality comes into play in this. And thus, ultimately, John, it may end up back in outcomes discussions as well. But I think there's an awful lot of refinement that's going to have to be done on this before we can even get to that point.
I would just add that we have been very mindful of the quality issue. Our program, in terms of its development, has been completely faculty-driven. On the general education side, all of our general education faculty from both institutions that worked on this identified the level at which they would consider mastery completed at the 80% level, which, when you think about it, is much higher than what we normally consider, where we're looking at either a 60 or 70. So we would actually, many of our faculty would actually argue that in some cases a well-developed competency model is actually more rigorous for students. Students have to master every single competency associated with a course. Oftentimes, in a traditional model, it's possible for a student to not master all the competencies but still manage to squeak by and pass that course. But quality is something that we have been very mindful of, and I think that most of the institutions out there that are working on these things also have been mindful of. Unfortunately, there are the few that are not always as clearly concerned about that.
Van, I agree with you totally, and as I said, I'm well aware of the quality of work that's being done by Commerce and South Texas, but I think the key phrase that you touched on is well developed.
Yeah.
And I think that's the ultimate challenge as any of us move forward with this.
Excuse me, can I ask one more question? As a faculty member, the only faculty member on this group, the courses that are being developed or have been developed at Commerce, have you discussed workload and how it will figure into a faculty member's workload? Will this be equivalent to a regular course, and have you done?
We actually are using a different. We're actually using a different workload model. We are not using a traditional faculty model. For the competency portion of the program, we're using an instructional team model. So students, when they enter the program, will be assigned an academic coach.
What this would do to workload, for faculty workload?
Well, we walked into it with the general model in place. And then on the upper division side, it's not changing how you would consider faculty workload at all. Those are going to be either, in the case of STC, there'll be hybrid courses. In the case of commerce, there'll be online courses. Both institutions were already doing accelerated courses of 7 weeks. In fact, that's one reason why we chose the 7 weeks. On the side of the lower division, we've been using faculty at the institutions to develop the curriculum. They're not going to be the folks that teach it. And again, at Commerce, we're looking at a very different instructional model because the instructional needs of that student or of that staff member is different. It's more of a tutorial model than it is a course instructor model. And Commerce, because they had the infrastructure with their graduate students, because they already had the infrastructure there of having an instructor of record and then graduate students, they're just adapting that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Van, for being with us today. One other suggestion I'd make to the committee before this next meeting is that in this recommendation that we can develop, we can provide some specificity to it as a direction to the coordinating board of things to look at. So, for instance, on the issue of prior learning assessment, if we want them to look specifically at that kind of issue or how MOOCs might factor into all this, that would probably be helpful to them if we can be specific. I think they kind of know what to do regardless. But on the cost study part of this, that's going to be more difficult because cost information is going to be more readily available in some programs than others. And everybody's sort of dabbling in this right now. Even if they got numbers back, I'm not sure how good those numbers would be going forward. It takes some time to sort of wash those things out. But anyway, we'll work on some language to get back to you before the next meeting. If you have any suggestions on how you'd like to see that worded or things added to it, be sure and get that to Paul, and he can circulate it to the members. Okay. The next charge we'll move to is the funding recommendation. Up to this point, we've had Paul look at two different possible recommendations. One regarding is just a simple enrollment growth plus inflation, which came out to an increase of about $300 million. He's also looked at returning the current rate to the 10-11 rate before the cuts from 12 and 13, and that was a cost of about $550 million. I suggested that if you had other ideas you might want to put on the table as a basis for the funding recommendation to send that. I did get one recommendation on that to look at. So, Paul, I would like for you to, for the next meeting, go back to the 1999 rate, which is when we went to had the changes made in the formula to the cost basis, and adjust that for inflation, and just look at that to see where we are today with respect to that rate. Okay. And then Paul didn't receive any other recommendations from anybody, so is there anything else you think we need to look at? If not, I know Lee Holcomb is here, and Lee had some different perspectives on looking at this issue also. So, Lee, why don't you go over your presentation?
Well, I'd like to thank the chair for the opportunity to address the committee. I would also ask the chair and the committee on, I believe we are a little bit behind on schedule. I've got about 10, 12 minutes of prepared remarks. Should I just go ahead and proceed? Yeah. Okay. All right. So please, as I go through this, please feel free to ask any questions. Hopefully we'll have some discussion after the presentation as well. But I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about some potential additional elements for consideration in determining formula funding levels. And these are proposed to you in hopes that it may make the process a bit more strategic and systematic. So I'm going to go ahead and direct your attention to slide 3. This is a table that lists all the additional elements that I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to briefly go through the elements. And then in subsequent slides, I'm going to talk specifically about each individual element. These elements, of course, are the subject of your deliberations, and I've made some projections for these elements. I would call these example projections. The levels and the projections themselves also, I think, would be subject of deliberation of the committee as well. So I use growth, but I use a bit of a modified growth model where I actually consider the number of new students coming in, and consider the number of leavers and the number of completers. So what you see on this slide is that the net growth is actually a result of projected number of new students minus leavers and completers. Now, leavers in this slide is defined as students who do not attain a GAI credential and do not return the next year. Completers are defined as students who actually attain a credential and leave the following year. So basically, you've got leaver rates and completer rates that undergird those estimates. In addition, I'll be going through and talking about some cost efficiency, inflation, of course, which should look familiar. And then lastly, it's a little bit a different item, is a consideration of the state proportion of education costs. So let me go back and talk a little bit about growth. What I've done is created a baseline funding level, which I think is a fairly close approximation of the method that Paul has adopted. The growth, of course, is, as I mentioned, a function of those three underlying factors: new students, leavers, and completers. The 128 million that you see is actually equal to 2,885 million minus the 1404 and minus the 1353. So what I've done is I've made projections on the number of new students moving forward through the 16-17 biennium. Those projections are based upon the agency growth projections. And that made baseline projections for the number of leavers through the 16-17 biennium. And that would correspond, of course, to a 1404 decrease. And then I made a baseline projection, the number of completers. And that would result in fewer students in the biennium, which would correspond to about a 1,353 million decrease for the recommendation. Now, one of the advantages of thinking about growth and decomposed in this way is that you can begin thinking strategically about projections for each of these. So, for example, for leavers, if you actually project fewer leavers, then that would obviously result in additional students in your biennium. And based upon the example projection of fewer leavers that I've done, that would result in additional 60 million to your recommendation. And again, we're going to go through these in more detail in subsequent slides. But in the baseline total, so then in the baseline completers, if you adjust that, if you actually forecast additional completers, which is a good thing, to get students through to completion, you have, everything else being equal, you have fewer students in the GAI system statewide, which would correspond to about a $63 million decrease to your recommendation. And then cost efficiency, I define cost efficiency here as the education cost per FTSE. And if you project some decreases in cost efficiency to the biennium, then you would result in about an $82 million decrease in the formula funding recommendation. Inflation, of course, is still there. You would add about $200 million. So for the baseline model that I'm be talking about throughout, you've got about a 16-17 formula funding level at about 4,557 million, which I think is fairly close to one of the projections Paul has given you. So Now what I'm going to do is go through each one of these projections and show you exactly what those values are. So thinking about projector leaver rate. Now, leaver, to remind you, a leaver is defined as a student who does not attain a credential, a GAI credential, and leaves and does not show up the next year. So the leaver rate is defined as the number of leavers divided by the total enrollment for that year. And as you see here, the trend over time, the leaver rate started at just above 17% in 2006. And decreased to 2009 and then went back up to about 16.5% in 2012, the last year for which we actually have data. Now that baseline model that I showed that corresponded to a recommended level of 4,557 million, the baseline leaver rate that I used to arrive at that estimate is 16.5%. Okay? Now, if you instead project that moving forward through the 16-17 biennium, you could decrease the leaver rate to 15.5%. And you did just that. You didn't mess with efficiencies or anything else. You would actually end up with about 14,000 additional FTESEs during the 16-17 biennium, which would correspond to the additional 60 million, which I referenced in the table. So I want to emphasize here that these projections are example projections that I think that if the committee should choose to consider this element in the formula funding level recommendation, that one of the focuses of your deliberations would be what the actual projection would be. And I think this is also where you can see where the projections get to be strategic. You are aware of many things that are happening at your campuses. You have a feel for how you could project levers based upon those strategies you're employing at your individual campuses and how that might boil up to the statewide level. Going on to completers. If you recall, the completers is defined as a student who attains a credential but does not return the following year. And for the actual data in Texas starting in 2006, we've got a fairly impressive increase in this, in the completer rate. That is the number of completers divided by total enrollment, from over 14% to almost 16% in 2012. Again, the last year for which we have actual data. Now, that baseline projection that I reference is based upon a continued 15.9% leaver rate statewide. If, on the other hand, you could project a continued increase in the completer rate through the 2016-17 biennium, that would result in 14,855 fewer FTESEs in the system, which would correspond to about $63 million less in your recommendation. Cost efficiency. I define cost efficiency as educational costs per FTSE, and this is using the agency sources and uses data. Education costs are the total costs minus research, public service, and auxiliary costs divided by FTSEs. And if you take a look at what's been happening statewide, and of course these are adjusted for inflation, from 2006 to 2012, you've got a hump, but it started off at about in the mid-15s and ends up in 15,791. Now, I project about a 0.5% decrease in costs per full-time student equivalent through 2015, and then which arrives us at 15,555. Now, assuming we use that as our baseline into the 16-17 biennium, and then if you actually allocate or assume a continued 0.5% decrease in the full-time, in the cost efficiency, that corresponds to about an $82 million less in formula funding due to increased cost efficiencies. So, and then lastly, again, this is sort of the different recommendation, projected state proportion of education costs. Obviously, this is a prime determinant of the actual allocation. So I thought I would look at what's going on elsewhere with the actual peer institutions that have been self-identified by GAIs and the accountability system. And it turns out that the state support as a percent of operational sources is less for Texas GAIs than for the peer institutions nationally. It's a difference of about 6 percentage points. So if you apply that 6 percentage points to the projected educational costs per FTSE during the 16-17 biennium, you get about $1 billion extra in formula funding if you want to rely upon formula to make up the difference. Okay, now that's quite a chunk of change. So you might consider taking a fraction thereof, which I took 20% or divided that total by 5. You come up with about $200 million additional funds for the 16-17 biennium, 197 million to be exact. So that concludes my actual prepared remarks. I want to emphasize that these elements and their projections. The projections are example projections. I believe that the deliberation of the committee, should you choose to adopt one or more of these elements, would be to come up with strategic measures and projections for these elements moving forward. I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Are there any questions for Lee? I know what you're trying to get to here is these efficiencies arguments, and BJ, I hate to interrupt you, but last time we included something in our recommendations where we try to take into account efficiencies, partly because of the overall budget situation, I think. But my recollection is that we just sort of picked an arbitrary number to account for that. Is that right? Okay. So, right. Right. So I think this will be a recommendation that we'll take up at the next meeting, and what we'll have on the table at that time is, of course, just the straightforward enrollment plus inflation, and then whether we want to adjust that number based on efficiencies like Lee's laid out, or some other measure which we've used in the past somewhat arbitrarily. We'll also be able to refer to, if nothing else, what it would take to get back to the 10-11 rate, and then also possibly Paul's going to work on this adjusted, inflation-adjusted 1999 rate when we went to the new formula to look at, and that can be something we include in our recommendations also, just as a kind of FYI to the board and to the legislature. So we can also refer to specifically to Lee's recommendation as another factor in all this. I guess I do think the efficiency argument is one, again, we've discussed in the past, and it's just a matter of whether we agree with this specific approach, which is tied to a methodology or not. And the only other comment I'd have is that in referring back to the, I guess your final recommendation ends up based upon comparing to national peers. Again, this is information that we can include in our recommendation, just like the 10-11 rate or whatever we choose to do with this information. So think about whether or not we should do that or not. I think the board would probably find that information useful. The legislature typically doesn't care what other states do, so you have to take that with a grain of salt. But it's certainly information we can include in our recommendations. So once Paul gets the new request done, along with what Lee's done here, again, we'll try to develop some language and circulate that, and then we'll just need a specific recommendation, obviously, when we get back. Any other questions, comments? Yeah, I did.
Just, if you had to summarize, you frame this as strategic, but you've got variables here. We know the direction each of them wants to be pointed. Sometimes the framework, the point of view shifts for me from looking at it from the institution's point of view, and then sometimes looking at it from the legislature's point of view. Who are you trying to? Is this strategy a strategy for the universities in terms of arguing their case to the legislature in terms of their performance and their?
Well, I actually suggested the possibility, and to Susan, and Susan sort of smiled patiently at me when I suggested this, but that if you were able to actually tie back the recommendation to some productivity and efficiency metrics moving forward, that perhaps the recommendation would be more durable in the legislature than past recommendations have been. That's obviously an open question. Some think that's a bit naive perspective. But, to whatever extent that's true, I guess that would be an opportunity gained. From the strategic perspective, from the institutional perspective, I think that there's lots of emphasis at institutions on trying to retain students, on trying to get students through to completion more quickly. And so I think this would be a way in which the committee could sort of aggregate what's happening at their specific institutions and other institutions across the state and come to a consensus on what is a reasonable projection of what's going to happen moving forward at the state level.
And we can work these numbers in a number of different ways. Might like Lee's recommendation a lot more if we decide to phase it in over 2 biennia instead of 5. So, well, that's something to think about.
And one thing that I want to make sure I emphasize is that we're doing these scenarios, right? For example, when I changed the number of leavers, it changed the leaver rate, as I showed. I assumed everything else stayed the same, right? So these are, sort of, I think, static. And I did that to emphasize and be able to show the effect of changing the leaver rate might have, right? And same goes with completed rate inefficiencies. So, I think part of the discussion is these things aren't really in actuality that divorced from each other. So, I think that's a complex, the consensus is, arrived at consideration of the joint interactions of those moving forward.
And I think that in terms of, like 2 years ago, we had this discussion about factoring in efficiencies. I don't necessarily think that the way to do that would be to tie it to specific numbers as you've developed them, but we could certainly, whatever we came up with, refer back to the fact that there are leavers, there are completers. Those do have an effect on what your enrollment is, and we can sort of factor that into the text that we use for the recommendations. But anyway, be thinking about that, and again, we'll circulate something on it. Thanks, Lee, for your presentation. I'd like to go on to the charges that we added last time, charges 4 and 5 in Paul's packet. And Paul, why don't you start out by just telling us what you did?
Thanks, John. So charge number 4, the idea here was to see what would happen if we removed the enrollment adjustment. And while last time I ran this, it didn't have much of an effect, this time we did have an outlier. Someone did change by 11%. So even with that, you can see it's fairly tight. I included a frequency chart there to show that the majority of the institutions are affected between -1% and 2% of their formula funding. Again, we do have the 11% change. So in order to do this, just so everybody knows what's in the calculations, this is the exciting part. What I did was I recalculated all 3 cost studies that go into the 14-15 biennium, and I recalculated the hours for that formula funding to eliminate the adjustments we do on the enrollment of the student. So it didn't matter who was in the class. If the class was registered on our course inventory as a doctoral level class, then it was included on the cost study and in the formula as a doctoral for all the enrollments, not just those doctoral students. Does that make sense? Or not enough sense? Don't I ask a question?
Okay.
I gave you a table to show you which institutions were affected in which way. Did anybody have any questions on that particular one?
I have a question.
Please.
Why do you think that it looks so different than the last time we did this?
Well, the one outlier is different because that particular institution for this base year has a significant number of master's level students enrolled in a doctoral level course.
Okay.
That's perfectly allowed and it's normal. From what I'm told, the first significant number of hours of a doctoral program, the students are actually enrolled as master's level students, and then they move up after a certain period. So it's the effect of some of the other complexities associated with how we let institutions report student enrollment.
I found it much more dramatic than I thought I would find it. Quite honestly, as a result of that, I'd be prepared to withdraw my motion.
I see.
It's not
Let's just, if we need to save time somewhere, we can do it.
Well, I appreciate that. It's not the first time that we've gone down a road and decided to back up. So if there's no objection, then we will dismiss charge 4. Can we go on to charge 5 then?
All right. So the intent on this one was to account for all the full-time teaching faculty that were teaching undergraduate students. What I did here was I kept all of the hours that were currently in the teaching experience supplement. So whether or not a tenure track professor was on the rolls as full-time teaching or not, those hours stayed in, and I simply added anybody who was not already in that group but was teaching undergraduate courses, and they were 100% teaching and a full-time faculty member. You can see that again, there are some pretty decent swings, but they're not too terribly bad if we were to elect this. I guess the big story on the impact here is it almost doubled the number of weighted semester credit hours that would go into the supplement.
Questions or comments? I guess, as I mentioned in the last meeting, this is an issue that's been discussed by the Foreman Advisory Committee in the past. The most recent charge on this, I guess, was a couple of biennia ago, and the charge was actually to consider doing away with the teaching supplement because it wasn't really doing what it was intended to do. So if we were to make a modification at this point, which increases the impact of it, or I suppose you could argue, part of the question for me, I guess, is what's the rationale for taking $1.5 million from UT Austin and giving it to UT Arlington? What is it that Arlington's doing with respect to the teaching supplement that makes them more entitled to the funding?
Well, I'll try to take a stab at it. I don't know that I can point to why you would move $1.5 million from one institution to the other. I would go back to the intent, I think, of the legislation, which was to try to assure that we had more experienced professors involved with the instruction of our students, and that we were not, for example, getting course-by-course adjuncts, perhaps working in a variety of different places with a variety of responsibilities involved in instructing, particularly undergraduates. And from my own experience as a provost at 2 larger institutions in 2 states, I can say with almost 80% certainty that when you have longer-term, full-time employees who are often lecturers are instructors full-time, engaged in the instruction of students in particular courses, and they tend to do this same course perhaps for a great deal of the time. They have considerable experience and considerable expertise and commitment. They're in their offices and they're holding office hours and so forth. To rival that of an assistant professor, for example, who may be working in a lot of ways trying to attain tenure, and what's going on in the classroom, particularly for an introductory course, may not be the first thing on their priority list. So I think in terms of the intent of the legislation, using the full-time instructor or lecturer, let us say, is very much within the intent of the statute.
Paul, may I ask you a question?
Sure, please.
I'm all for faculty who teach or who are full-time faculty being counted. I was a little shocked at how this turned out, particularly when I compared UT Austin to Texas A&M. I don't quite understand why a school that has a larger appropriation would come out losing $80,000, and while the other one is going to lose $2 million. And I just wondered if you could explain how that worked or how.
Sure. I mean, it's pretty straightforward quantitatively speaking. The school that's losing, and actually A&M's gaining 80,000. The school that's gaining there,
yes.
Proportionately speaking, they have more hours for, I should say they have more weighted semester credit hours for faculty members who are full-time teaching undergraduate courses. That's really the only variable shifting here is the number of hours we can add to the teaching supplement. And so the loss for UT Austin is associated with them not having necessarily additional hours put in, because if you look at the second chart I gave, I showed how the teaching supplement changed, and UT Austin's teaching supplement goes up by 58%. But that doesn't really compare to A&M's increase, which is 64%. And so that's what makes the difference. It's just it's sheer numbers at that point. Did that answer the question, or you look
I'll
like you
chew
might?
on it a little bit.
And I think this is an unintended consequences, Perry, on this, that from the point of view of UH Downtown, because that institution is the lowest funded institution in the state, and because it has the lowest tuition, it has to rely on adjuncts. And so the result is you're taking $600,000 away from an institution that right now doesn't have the funds to pay for full-time lecturers. You know, I would love to move towards full-time lecturers instead of the level of use of adjuncts that UH Downtown has to do to make the budget. So I think that's one of the consequences of this particular shift.
Yeah, could I speak to that? I share the same concern. As I look down the list, and John asked this question about UT Arlington versus UT Austin, to me that's not necessarily the more significant. It is what Ed has talked about, in that you have 600,000 being lost there, or 485,000, for example, being lost at Prairie View. In other words, at some of the institutions that have perhaps the lesser capacity to respond to this is problematic. And so why I, on the one hand, think that the logic behind the suggestion is strong. I also recognize the impact. And I think that if we did anything like this, that we probably should consider over, if not 2 biennia, then 3, or something that we count a third and then maybe 2/3 and then the whole thing, if we were going to go forward with this proposal. I think I would like to ask this question maybe though of Paul. The last time we considered the supplement, was it to eliminate it or to transfer it into performance? To use that 10% for the performance segment.
The last charge, or I guess the last recommendation that was made by the coordinating board was to take the money that was being funded for the supplement and put that onto the performance-based funding.
Right.
That was being recommended at the time.
Right. So it's considerably different than eliminating it and to plowing it back into the general formula, as opposed, but we were going to move it to something else, which we're still considering, which is performance-based funding, and why we can't get anywhere with it. Even we can agree, but the legislature doesn't go along with it. So I'm not sure that history applies here. I mean, maybe at some point, if I continue on the committee, would be to ask should we keep it then? If we're not going to include people who are this engaged in teaching and they're full-time, then maybe it's an argument not to have it in the supplement at all, but to have it part of the whole general formula. But that being said, I recognize what Ed has said, that it does have a considerable impact on some smaller institutions that I think is problematic.
I think one of the things you're going to have to look at also is, while it does have impact on the smaller institutions, when a legislator looks at this, the percentages are so small when you just look at the percentages without looking at the dollars. Is it a significant enough impact? And I think that probably goes back, Perry, to your question, should it be included at all?
Right.
But if there are others who would like to either ask questions of Paul or make comments, we're certainly open for that right now.
Yeah.
Well, I was in favor in terms of looking at the full-time folks who might not be on the tenure and tenure track, because at TWU we have over 100 that we classify as clinical faculty. Even though we're not at the bottom of the heap in the funding, though, I would have a hard time going back to my campus and justifying nearly $500,000 in less funding. And I'm sort of surprised it turned out that way, knowing what the proportion is. I don't doubt the level of instruction that comes from these people, and I actually applaud trying to move away from adjuncts, but we couldn't sustain a hit like that.
I think part of it was that it was 100% teaching. So if you've got researchers that are teaching even 3/4 time, they're not in here.
Well, actually, all our clinical faculty don't do research; they're just to teach, and so that couldn't explain it in this case. And the truth of the matter is, tenure track faculty cost us more than clinical faculty do. And in fact, our whole salary formula is based on that.
Other comments, questions, recommendations?
I would just say I'll do this and then give a recommendation. I had some concerns about bringing this motion forward, not so much from what we see at the moment, but having perhaps some faculty in our system who are tenure and tenure track saying, what in the heck are you trying to do? Because this is a big issue, as you know, nationally, and that is using faculty such as lecturers and instructor and non-tenure line in the classroom. But I've said to faculty in the past, and I think it to be true, that indeed having such full-time lecturers and instructors allows the loads for the tenure track faculty to be as they are. If not in terms of the total load or the number of courses, certainly in terms of the distribution of those courses. So I think these folks, these full-time lecturers and instructors, play a magnificent role in our institutions. And they do not get enough credit for what they contribute in terms of the total education in our state. With that said, I'll withdraw the motion. Thank you.
miss something?
No.
The only thing I would add to what Perry has said, the use of non-tenured full-time faculty is one of the ways that I think many of us, one of the directions many of us have had to go to try to avoid going totally into adjunct faculty. And from my own experience, and Perry, you and others can speak for yourselves, it is far better, far more effective having those individuals who are full-time, dedicated totally to teaching. They do teach a heavier load than the tenure-track faculty do. And it is at least an option, and I think a better option, than going so heavily into adjuncts, though most of us have had to go into adjuncts.
One thing I'd add to that is that when Senator Ratliff first brought this up, the concern was not adjunct faculty. It was graduate assistants teaching courses. And he was looking for a way to get more senior faculty members into the classroom as opposed to having graduate assistants teach courses. And like I said, I think in the last time we looked at this, the coordinating board had some data to show that it wasn't necessarily having the desired effect, but at that time I think everybody agreed that there were some institutions that benefited under this supplement, and particularly smaller institutions, and that we should keep it for that reason. But anyway, just FYI.
I do want to just respond to the comment that having these folks can lighten the load for the tenure and tenure track. That might be true at the larger universities, but at the smaller universities, it's not. All of our tenure track faculty almost have 4-4 loads, despite the research requirements that we have for them too. So it does help us to have these full-time people, but the tenure and tenure track people are teaching just the same load.
Okay, if there's no other comments, then we'll move to the last charge for the day, outcomes-based funding. Last meeting I had suggested that if there were specific things regarding outcomes-based funding that you wish to put before the committee, you try to get that to Paul ahead of time so that we can review that. My understanding is you didn't get anything, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So I think we discussed last time that one of the purposes of the charge, I guess, is that because the legislature did not adopt anything on outcomes-based funding this last session, that we, at a minimum, look at any adjustments to the recommendations that would perhaps address some of the legislative concerns that came up during the session. The one that I've laid out is that if it's a part of redistributing current formula money, it's kind of a non-starter with the legislature. So that running this essentially as a separate formula, I think has a better chance of getting some buy-in, and of course that does allow the legislature then to make a separate funding decision on this, which that will, I suspect, largely depend upon what the overall budget situation looks like. But in the last time that we did something like this, I guess been 3 or 4 biennia ago, when we actually had an outcomes-based formula that was separate, at the last minute they did in fact put some money into it. And it was proceeded to be cut the next session when the budget wasn't so good. But that's just
cut in
the
half
nature
one
of the
session, and then it went away.
That's right.
So we did have it.
That's right.
Session and a half.
So other than treating it as a separate formula, what other ideas would people like to put on the table to perhaps improve upon this?
John, I don't know that this is not a recommendation for improvement, but the other thing, that probably is what most of us heard more than anything else, was the concern about redistribution of existing funds. The other one that I think was also pretty consistent was the one-size-fits-all, trying to make this formula fit every institution regardless of its mission. And I heard lots of impassioned comments, including in open discussions, about does this take in the mission and the varying missions of the institutions. And we've done a lot of talking about Tennessee, and I know Tennessee is smaller and has a smaller number of institutions. But one of the very clear facets of the Tennessee system is that they did identify different missions for different institutions. And I did hear some discussion, although John really has wrapped it into the comment about the distribution, about shouldn't there be a separate fund for this kind of outcomes-based or performance. And my understanding is there is a distinction, which we may or may not have made, between what's performance and what's outcome-based. But those are the three areas that I heard coming up consistently.
And Dr. Short actually was in Tennessee when that model was developed. And so, if we had somebody from Tennessee come talk to the committee, Paul already, because he can go back into a couple of years ago, has something set up to where, similar to what Tennessee did, where institutions could select what percentage of their funding, all that kind of thing. So if that's something y'all would like to see, we can easily bring that back.
Would you like to?
I would encourage that, if we could do that. Take a look at that, because, again, if you want to look at what are the hallmarks of that approach that have played well and been seen as very fair, would be the ability of institutions who have developed their institutional profiles so that it's based on their unique mission, can, to some extent, decide the weights among those criteria based on their unique mission. And I hear that again in some of our other discussion. It's not a one-size-fits-all. We are different institutions, and so being able to have some opportunity to look at how differentiation would play, I think would be a powerful step for us to get back to here. And if you've done that, I would like to see that.
The model that went through revision, basically what it did was it allowed each institution to pick what they wanted for a weight for each one of the metrics we included, with some restrictions. Certain amount of weight, only a maximum amount of weight could go on any one metric, was I think what we landed with. I think 30% was, and I think what we did was we made all the weights add up to 100% so that it would show a distribution. Go ahead.
I was just going to make the point that the institutions set those weights, again, approved by the coordinating board and the governing boards, based on the development of an institutional profile, which was tied to Carnegie classification, unique population served, and that kind of thing. So the institutions actually went through that development process, and then the coordinating board had something in hand with which to review those. Not that they said yes or no, but in order to give some rationale for why certain percentages were chosen.
Okay.
And it turned out to be a very fair process.
Okay, and I do want to introduce Trey Miller. He's here from RAND. If there are other measures that you want to look at, he's here to kind of give a national perspective, because RAND's been working on some of this stuff. And so if there are other measures that you want to look at, or other methodologies that you want to look at, the commissioner is prepared to pay RAND to help out here.
Susan, the only thing I would add, I think Dr. O'Brien, who was on this committee last year, kept lobbying to the end for the graduates per 100 full-time student equivalent. Primarily because, and this to some degree goes back to mission of institutions. Obviously, as an upper-level university, I don't have any first-time full-time freshmen. All of my students are transfer. When you come down to how many numbers are actually being used to calculate our graduation rate, sometimes it's as few as 20 students. But it doesn't just affect the upper levels. It affects a lot of the general academics who have a lot of transfers from community colleges. And so that's why, and I noted also that Tennessee used that as one of their major metrics was that graduates for FTSC, because then it doesn't matter where your students come from. All that matters is for the numbers of students that you have, full-time student equivalents, how many of them are actually graduating on an annual basis?
That is one of the current metrics that we've used.
Yes, it is.
And the other thing that has been raised, and I'm not sure if y'all want to do it again, is to look at scaling them, because some of them, the number of points are very small, and some of them, the number of points are very large. It is scaling them to where they're all kind of have equal weight among the dollars, and I don't know if that's something I would be interested in us looking at.
I'm interested in actually scaling them to the proportions of the population. I mean, because that would help a great deal. I mean, to just pick up on Mark's point is that some of us are we're 66% of transfer institution, and that makes that the graduation of transfer students is much more important than really in the system than the graduation of FTIC. So so anyway, if we could think about, because this is related to the weighting too, the way that you ultimately would just justify the weights. But I'm particularly interested in maybe hearing from you exactly, because this set of metrics that is here is an interesting set. Was that selected because amongst all the other possibilities for any particular reason?
Well, I'm just kind of coming into the discussion here and reviewing the proposals here, and so I'm not at a stage where I really know where the
these metrics actually came from the committee last time.
Yeah.
These were the metrics that were introduced by the committee in 26 different runs.
29.
So I think, though, that question it's a valid one for Trey. He could determine if these were the best set of metrics for this set of institutions or not, if you wanted him to do that.
Or maybe offer other ones. I don't know.
I think that's a real key to it.
Yeah.
Are these the best set of metrics, particularly for where the state wants to go by rewarding performance? I mean, is it moving?
Well,
And do these measure it? And
Sure.
do we really know where the state wants to go in terms of report? I mean, we had a proposal.
Don't know nationally.
We had a proposal the last time, and great. How many runs? 29, 30, or more?
Let's just be honest. There's not an actual number that I'm willing to share, but we're going to go with 26, and we're going to leave it at that.
And we came up with this as a recommendation, and the board went forward with it, and it was not successful. And I suspect it wasn't successful because, as with the two motions I brought forward, it had impacts. Some lost and some gained. And it is a paradox that we all talk about it, and we talk about it nationally. And when I was in Ohio, we talked about it back in the late 1970s and all through the 80s and through the 90s. But the conclusion that's stated in the University of Alabama's report on it is it's had no impact on student learning outcomes. So what we have, in a sense, if you look at the data, is it hasn't had an impact yet, but it is a very appealing political movement in one sense. But when you get down to actually making the sausage, it's not so appealing.
Very good analogy.
So, on the one hand, I think we need to do something that will at least appear to be moving in the right direction, but at the same time find the metrics that will result in not having a tremendous impact at first, or even a 1% perhaps impact at most of our institutions. And then from that point forward going on, because if it's going to have a very big impact at first, it isn't going to pass. So, I don't know, it's a paradox. It seems to be very, very appealing until you get down to actually the doing of it.
And I think John may have brought up a very good point with having it totally outside the funding. There's good and bad tied to that. It doesn't have a direct impact on the formula amounts, but when it's time to cut things, it's kind of sitting off all on its own, and that's a pretty easy place to go, okay, that goes away, and see, we didn't change your formula. So there's, you got the good and bad here.
Well, it also raises the question, and I much prefer to see it separate.
Okay.
But it also raises the question, and when you get down to that, and there's so much money to spend in the state, is it ultimately going to come out of what would have gone into formula funding?
Probably. Yeah.
So at the end of that, you basically get the money the one biennium, lose it the next, and the story on the street is your funding wasn't cut. If you take it and put it aside from the formula, that's what happened last time, and so that's what you leave yourself vulnerable to again.
I think that one of the things that I liked in the Alabama study is this notion about, whether it's, there's how much money is involved and whether there's enough to incentivize people or not. But one of the things I liked about the notion of engaging the stakeholders is we are all involved in this process of shifting from enrollment to success. In one way or the other, we all are doing that. I don't do anything else. So I would love to see it set up in such a way that, I really think we're going to improve. And I would like it set up that if you improved, you got something, instead of it being set up, as, well, those that only the very top performers got something. It just, if it was predictable that if you improved, you got something, and if you didn't improve, you would lose something. If you went down, you would lose. So that would, I have to tell you, as an administrator, that's something I could communicate to the faculty to say that now it's not just about the number of students we have, it's how successful the students are, and that we're working towards that end, and now state policy would align with what we're trying to do desperately inside the institution, to make these changes.
And I will say the community colleges are working on the same type of model right now, because they did go into outcomes-based funding 10% this time, and they are in the process of trying to develop a model that will do exactly what you're talking about. That those who are improving get some money, those that are not improving lose some money but don't fall off a cliff type thing. And they've got one model that they're in the process of discussing. I don't know that they've reached total agreement with it. We can ask if they would be willing for us to share that model with y'all. But
Susan, as I recall, the commissioner said when we had our first meeting, if you want to shift the whole model to basically you're competing against your own performance, as opposed to competing against one another in some manner, which then raises the whole question of what's your mission as opposed to mine, what's your student population as opposed to mine. But how are you doing within your own institution, and are you making progress?
And that is our charge, actually, in working with the community colleges, that we would do that same thing, where it's a comparison to themselves, not to the others. And that's what we're working on, that one. I'm not going to say we have agreement, but we're working.
I agree with including these other metrics that have been noted, as well as going back to what you said earlier about the number of degrees produced. I think at the end of the day, when we come forward with a proposal, there will have, as you look at the distributions, we have to find the metrics that both make sense and ends up not having about 3 or 4 winners and about 20 losers. That would, I hate to back into a mode, but if you're going to find one that probably will work, that's probably what's going to have to be.
Well, I don't think there's absolutely no question that when legislators started looking at the breakdowns, and they saw the redistribution of funds. And even if it was not huge amounts, it was shifting. And that became the first big obstacle.
Well, is this someplace where this biennium we make a recommendation of, okay, here's the number of points, and then moving forward, you only compete against yourself? Or do we say, okay, here's where they were 2 years ago on these same metrics and compete against that baseline that has already passed? And that was one of the issues we ran into with the community colleges, and they said, okay, this year is going to be the base year for the next biennium. So for this one, it would be for the 18-19 biennium. It is a compete against yourself biennium moving forward. And so we have smart people here to help us out.
Well, so these are all issues that other states are grappling with currently, and looking at some of the issues, you're bringing up the same questions that other states are bringing up, and particularly with dealing with different student populations that institutions have, different missions, and there are ways that people are experimenting, states are experimenting with dealing with these issues. I've done some work on, particularly in this area of dealing with the differing student populations. And I think if there's some openness to considering some additional metrics in the system, or ways to account for the differing student population, that's something I could think about. Particularly, looking within kinds of cells of defining student characteristics. So, students with particular backgrounds, what's the completion rate of at-risk students with SAT scores within some range, and trying to get closer to apples comparisons, and then aggregating up some way in an accounting framework. I don't want to get into kind of nitty-gritty, but there are ways to do this that we could consider, and anyway, that's I'll leave it at that at this point. So.
There's two issues that have been consistently brought up since probably since we first started working on outcomes-based funding, certainly since we completed work last time. One is the institutional mission issue, which we realized last time that it was just difficult to get to that issue with as many institutions as we had, and with trying to limit the number of metrics. The other issue is the issue that Ed's raising of an allocation model, or should it be more of a growth model, I call it, where you have your own benchmarks and you're measured against those things. What we ended up with was an allocation model. That's what we're familiar with, obviously, here in Texas. The other thing I'll say, though, is that even if you do this growth model, you're going to end up with unsatisfactory results, because it's still going to be subject to whatever the legislature chooses to appropriate. And you're counting on an appropriation which may not get there. So you may end up with results that don't differ that much from the allocation model, but I think from an institutional perspective, it's nice to think of it in terms of the growth and what you have to achieve, and then if you're disappointed when it's all over with, it won't be the first time you were disappointed, probably. But I think it's worth looking at. I think that's an issue that we can look at again and see if. However, if we go to this more of a growth approach, it is a lot more work than if we stick with as the basis of our current model. So we'll have to take that into consideration. The same with the institutional mission issue. This is one that I really get puzzled about. Tennessee's been the most aggressive at this, yet they do not have a metric for at-risk students.
For the university, yes, there is one. I don't have it in front of me, but there is an operationalization of at-risk. It was defined as Pell and one other way. Unless they've changed it in the 3 years. I think that, have you looked at Tennessee's? There is. There is there.
I recall that there was that aspect in the Tennessee system, but I'm.
This not the formula here? This is what we were given last 2 years ago when we were.
No, there.
Now, at the institutional level, there may be a number of things that are different. But in terms of the basic model, this is the way it was laid out.
Well, I know there was, okay.
I mean, my assumption was, as what they were doing is that they were addressing that issue through institutional mission. That there were other metrics here that took into account mission, and of course, each institution had an ability to affect that metric.
They did. For instance, one institute, I think that's right, one institution defined it as, because of the population they served, those Pell and over 25 years old, because they served a large adult population. So you are correct. But again, I mean, it had to fit the mission of the institution and its unique population, how they defined that.
That may have been addressed in what the institutional mission, so they grouped their institutions into these had this mission, these had this, so the at-risk factor may have come into that piece of it, which in some ways would simplify the model if you grouped them based on that type of thing.
Right. And I think that's right. You can't, now, some institutions may not be happy with that approach, as opposed to an explicit metric on it for at-risk students, but everybody would have to look at that. The other thing, which I assume this simplified things as well, is that when institutions had the ability to adjust their own metrics, they had to do so within a band that I guess the
coordinating board.
The coordinating board,
again, back to their institutional missions, foundational to that approval process.
So I know when we discussed this 2 years ago, the concern was with 35 plus institutions all making adjustments to their metrics, you really aren't going to know what you're going to end up with without a whole lot of time spent trying to get to that point. If you established a band, then you can certainly limit the variables that you'd have to deal with, especially if it's an allocation model. Now, if you're going to just base this on growth, that actually might make it simpler to do that way. But so our challenge is, if we're going to be making significant changes to this, to where we ended up last time, we have to have a plan of work to get there. Last time we had what was supposed to be a subcommittee. It turned out to be a committee,
pretty much of the whole.
Committee of the subcommittee or something. But yeah, it was a committee of the whole. I guess that's a good description of it, because everybody wanted to have some involvement in this. So I think the first thing is, do we? Let me say this: if we're going to reopen things substantially, which is kind of what I'm hearing from at least some of you. How many here don't care if they're involved in such an effort? At least it's sort of again, whatever, if we had a subcommittee, whatever they did, they would come back to the full committee, and the full committee would then be able to hash that out to whatever extent they feel necessary. But nevertheless, in terms of that ground level work that's going to have to be done, is there anybody here that's really not interested in participating in that? Okay, that's kind of the response we got last time.
Yeah. And here we go.
Okay, if that's the case, then I think Paul and I are going to have some conversations and decide what the best way to proceed is. It doesn't surprise me that there's a desire to do that. It only surprised me that he didn't receive any input since the last meeting. So it's extremely important over the next week, preferably, certainly within the next 2 weeks, that if you have specific things you want to look at in this formula changes or different ways of doing it, get it to Paul, and that will be the starting point for the next level of the discussion on where we go with this.
John, I think also just looking at the metrics that we're already using there and kind of trying to think through our own minds again about what were we attempting to accomplish with those. And what's the strength? What's the strength and weakness of each one of those, especially given our experience of the last legislative session?
And I think because I think there are things about Tennessee that maybe I didn't understand of how they grouped, and that may simplify the whole thing. So, if Paul, if you would provide us some input into that, and we'll ask Trey to give us input into that, and maybe that might be one way of simplifying the whole model by kind of organizing the missions of the institutions, whether it's through accountability groups, Carnegie, different factors that should be grouped together. We're open to that, but if y'all could kind of maybe say, here are some factors that should be included in how the institutions are grouped, because I think having that, grouping them that way might be a really good way of simplifying the whole model.
And I guess to follow up with Mark's comment, just by way of background of the things to keep in mind, based on the discussions we've had really over the past 3 or 4 years, when it comes to looking at being measured against your own metrics and this growth issue, when that was discussed under the performance incentive funding model a couple of biennia ago, the concern was that if you're an institution with capped enrollment or near capped enrollment, that's going to limit what you can do. And if that institution already has a very high graduation rate, that's going to limit your growth as well. So there are limitations on certain institutions in that model that we would have to take into consideration.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that the Tennessee model does is that it broadens the categories of metrics. It's not surprising that the distinction between research universities and comprehensive universities, that distinction, which we do, I know in Texas we don't want to say we do have that, but we do have that distinction, and that's a big cluster of the categories, and so in the Tennessee model, in the research universities, research funding is a metric that's in there. And it's weighted differently than some of the other things that do affect when you have a capped enrollment piece. So I think it's again, the mission and the profile, I think, is crucial. The characteristics of the university, and there are half a dozen in the way it's sorted out. In Tennessee, I was, when I saw it really fell into play rather simply. And generally speaking, it's two big categories. There are some exceptions to that, which really heavily weighted populations, Pell Grants people. There's some that have 75%, Pell. That's a totally different institution. But it's not a huge number of metrics and that end up in these clusters. I do think in reading this morning the Alabama article that in the last couple of years the pattern has begun to shape up a little bit that wasn't there a few years ago.
And I'll only throw one wrench into this. The statute says that we're to recommend 10% of undergraduate funding. And that's one of the reasons that all the metrics kind of dealt with the undergraduate level. So,
right, and that was the next point I was going to go to, is that we excluded graduate students from the model because of that, and actually on the issue of research, there was actually some discussion as to whether or not the legislature would buy a formula that was rewarding research for all institutions. So those are just some of the minefields we've tried to navigate before, but we can work through those things once we kind of get the group together, but we do need to get some more focus to all this. So again, I encourage you to send ideas to Paul. We'll work through that and try to figure out a work plan to get us to where we need to get to. And obviously, we need to make a lot of progress between now and November 18th or whenever that is. But we do have a December meeting, so that it obviously doesn't have to all be worked up by the next meeting.
And we will be glad to do whatever kind of, we have all sorts of data, as y'all know, because y'all give it to us, so.
Yeah,
Paul has weekends, it's okay.
I will also say I did, with a colleague of mine, did a study looking at some input adjustments to outcome measures at Texas institutions, trying to take into account the characteristics of the incoming student population. And that's done with Texas data. There's a report and some policy briefs out. I'd be happy to share that with the committee here. I think the methodology may be a little complicated for actual policy-making purposes.
This was dissertation work.
Well, it was part of my dissertation, but we've extended it and done work. We had money from Gates Foundation trying to develop kind of a roadmap for states that are working to build performance metrics with state administrative databases. I think for policy-making purposes, again, trying to unpack this methodology that does kind of sophisticated statistical modeling into looking at means of outcomes within very tightly defined student populations and trying to aggregate up is a lot more kind of transparent, and maybe an approach we could kind of consider if we're interested in kind of going down this path of trying to look at this, take into account the student populations at the institutions. And so I have a base going forward with that, and so if we want to consider that, I'd be happy to make some proposals.
And what I would suggest is that after we've received input from the committee, then we can probably give you something more specific that you can help us work with on that.
Sure.
Okay, so I guess everybody's fine with this direction that we're going. Any other comments on this, or either from a process standpoint or a substance standpoint? Okay, then again, get with Paul on whatever it is you feel like needs to be adjusted out of this. If it's a completely different framework, that's fine. He just needs to have some pretty specific proposals on exactly how we'd go about it. And then we'll try to figure out the best way to get this focused for the meeting of this. I don't know that it'll require a meeting between now and November 18th. I'm hoping we can avoid that. It really kind of depends on the nature of what we end up with, but there'll certainly be communications back and forth going on before the November meeting in preparation for that. That's okay with everybody? Okay. Any other business for the committee today? Oh, that's it? Okay. We are adjourned, and our next meeting is November 18th.